my name is Dr. Jean. Well, dear future people, we are going to talk about three topics today. One topic is fruits and fruit tree. Let's start off with the idea that left and right are human concepts. And left is always relative to right. There is no left without right. It is defined that way. Something more to the left is always relative to something more to the right. So it is with the soul and the body. The soul is relative to the body. There is no soul without a body because these two things are different aspects of the same thing. So left, right, soul, and body are organic entities. That means that one has no meaning together with the other. They live in close connection together. One does not exist without the other. One has no meaning without the other. So they are in organic relationships with each other. So they are different aspects, different angles of the same thing. But because they are different aspects from different angles, they need different approaches when we try to describe them. They have different needs, different nourishment, and different care. They have differences between them. Now, the soul is like the seed inside a fruit, and the body is like the flesh of the fruit. To us, the seed seems uniform because it looks that way. However, we understand when we dig a little bit deeper that the seed has a large amount of variety. It represents the unique genetic code that is relevant not only to the fruit, but the entire fruit tree, and more than that, all fruit trees and all living beings. So again, it is something organic, in close relationship with the flesh of the fruit, with the fruit tree, but it is not uniform. It is not distinct. To us, the seed seems like a separate entity, but in reality, it is an organic part of the fruit tree. The fruit tree is an integral whole. The whole forest is an integral whole. And the community of living being is an integral whole. Now, the individual fruit may fall down and rot on the tree, but the seed nevertheless stays alive. And it carries the essential information of the whole tree. The seed has the potential to create a new tree, which is a continuation of the old fruit tree, but it is also different. A continuation, non-separate, but nevertheless unique. So the seed carries the information that has been affected by the lifetime of the old tree. This is very important to understand. So this information is not just different in every generation, but these differences are also dependent on circumstances and conditions that happened during the lifetime of the tree. And these circumstances and conditions and the different reactions or creative actions all influence this. So when we hear something like that, it is I, a unique fruit, new, sovereign, and independent. While I live, I am free. When I fall, all is lost. Then we think about an adorable adolescent, a teenager. Teenagers think that, and that is fine. This is their nature. However, we need to look beyond this and understand that the fruit belongs to the tree, not only physically, but also as an information, as a kind of spiritual or whatever togetherness. There is a deep connection. This uniqueness that is represented by that seed inside the fruit is not separate. It is linked to the whole tree. It is linked to the whole community of the living. So the life of the tree and the previous lives of previous trees strongly influence this uniqueness. The uniqueness is not random. It is, to a large degree, influenced by all these life events. A separate individual perspective creates imaginary boundaries, not only in space but also in time, as if a new tree was separate, as if the fruit was separate from the integral whole, which is represented by life. So one imagines that the fruit is a unit because it is separate, because it is separate uniquely, and it has well-defined borders. So we see that boundaries are artificially created not only in space but also in time. This is the consequence of what we might term as individual perspective or unit thinking. Now, here is a depiction of to demonstrate the difference between an individual perspective, unit thinking, and a wider, more organic perspective. So what we see on the left-hand side, that this picture is seen as if it was seen through the eye of an individual, whereas the picture on the right-hand side depicts a larger perspective, as something might be seen from a wider perspective, maybe a perspective of a community. Now, if we concentrate, like we see on the left-hand side, on the narrow individual perspective while ignoring the wider perspective, then we are going to focus on the unit, that is the fruit, or the flesh of the fruit, if we take this to the extreme, and we ignore the uniqueness, but non-separate uniqueness of the seed, and the whole tree, and the forest, and the community of living. Units, by their own intrinsic properties, lead to the categories of competition, laws, rules, and relative uniformity. Multitude, masses, mass communication, mass production. You have classes and sets of separate units, each with its own unique individual perspective, which is separated out from the community perspective. This kind of perspective will eventually lead to loneliness, lack of direction, feeling lost, the lack of identity, hopelessness, confusion, depression, and weakness are the natural consequences of such a worldview. Overemphasis of one aspect over other aspects always lead to distorted view, disharmony, and inorganic thinking. If we understand this, then we can make kind of a joke, a metaphor, which is intended like a little joke. So let's imagine different scales for the idea of organisms. So generally when we talk about organisms, we frequently mean an individual body, a separate unit body, a separate unit organism. But if we project this out to the whole society, then we see that the muscle in an individual body is like workers in a society. The digestive system is like economy, together with blood supply. The nervous system is like administration. The immune system is like military and police. And the soul is like religion and spiritual aspects. The same patterns are recognizable at all human scales, at the scale of the individual physical body and at the scale of the whole society. The same way from cells to galaxies, we see organisms, but we see them at a different scale. What we consider the most is the scale that is most common, that is most familiar to us. But that doesn't mean that more rare, because too big or large or too small scales are not relevant. They are relevant. We just need to understand them as potential organisms. Organic systems have the fundamental characteristic of essential parts, organic parts, with different functions working in concert. So there is harmony with multiple level feedbacks, checks and balances, and multiform communication in the physical body. This goes all the way from second messengers inside the cells to autocrine, paracrine, and endocrine influences represented by hormones or chemokines or adhesion molecules and a large number of other things. There is also action potential between neurons. There is synaptic interactions and a lot more. So in other words, we have multiple levels of communication, creating an organic interaction between different parts of the body, which are unique but not separate. And this leads to the idea of homeostasis in physiology or in biology in general. The organism is robust. It is able to handle stimuli and influences at multiple levels, from focused attention and sensitivity to improved processing and memory, creating stability. If harmony and stability in the system is lost, then such a state of confusion might arise as to endanger the stability of the system, leading to overwhelming effects. And if that is to happen, then the robustness of the system is not sufficient to handle that information. So then reorganization will have to be done to re-establish stability. Now, in a state of disbalance and confusion, the system may experience parasitic attacks, such as viruses, cancer, and so-called recyclers. Why is that? Well, parasites see disbalance, and in the state of disbalance, they reprogram and recycle the organism that they feel is weak, is unable to sustain itself. Parasitism is therefore a natural phenomenon. It is there is a physical projection for it, yes, viruses, cancers, and bacterial infections, etc. But it is really a function connected to recycling. So parasitism is a very real thing that we see everyday life, not only in terms of physical, biological, medical aspects, but also in the mind. So let's take this metaphor a little bit further, and then we can say that cancer is like a revolution. That means that part of the organism ignores the signals that are usually directed towards it from different organic parts of the organisms. And it sets up its own independent system inside the organism with its own economy, its own program, establishing a new identity. Isn't that what revolution is? But that is what cancer is. Viruses, for example, they easily travel using usual form of communications as carriers, attach and reprogram cells, or reprogram minds. Simple artificial sugars, refined sugars, industrial sugars, and salt here as a preservative, for example, they are integrated into food, they are easily absorbed and digested, then they reprogram the endocrine system, causing a wide array of metabolic diseases, changing behavior and lifestyle. What we see here in all these instances of parasitism is lack of sufficient robustness to handle these scenarios. Now, as we are talking about parasites in terms of the physical, medical, biological aspects or fields, so we can have mental viruses as well. Music, films, religion, mass communications, or any kind of cultural activity may provide a means to carry these mental viruses. They are, like refined sugars, easily and promptly processed and absorbed and integrated, and then they reprogram the organism, changing its behavior, also changing its interpersonal communications and lifestyle. Aided by mass communication, mass culture, mass traditions, and mass institutions, which are standards, which are fixed. Recyclers, for example, bacteria, invade the organism, which is deemed too weak to survive, and then degrade it, prepare for recycling its elements into new organisms. Now, there is a potential defense for these parasites, both in terms of physical, biological parasites, and in terms of mental parasites. And this defense consists of life experience, the life experience mechanism, and life experience related thinking. Constant reorganization, re-evaluation, unique integration will help reorganizing, re-establishing stability. It will aid the growth of robustness. And with more robustness, this will create a defense for any kind of overwhelming information. There needs to be constant mental exercise, constant cultivation with high maintenance of unique, special characteristics due to the uniqueness of life experience. So this defense with high degree of robustness is connected with the idea of abundance. So we have multiple sources of information, all kinds of different information, but this information is uniquely processed so through the life experience mechanism. And then instead of knowledge, which may be focused here or focused there, we have a wide spectrum of knowledge, which is highly unique and highly organized. Abundance will lead to the idea of dilution. It dilutes overwhelming experiences by integrating any specific influence with already an organized and balanced system in homeostasis. Whenever confusion arises, that just means that the system needs to reorganize. Now, reorganization of the system might be, might assume different means. I mean, sleeping, resting, reflecting, talking it over with others. There can be multiple levels of reorganization. What I want to emphasize here is that reorganization is very important because if confusion is led to go beyond a certain level, then the system will destabilize. And the natural consequence of that will be loss of identity and depression. Unique, specific local responses defy universal domains and absolute reference systems. Now, we will talk a whole lot about that later. But again, it is very important to understand that locality means uniqueness of responses and uniqueness of creative action, which means that there are no universal, absolute, objective information processing because information is processed differently in terms of local domains. For instance, idolatry, the idolatry of the absolute, of the remote, of the central, of the uniform, will be impossible because each organic part, each locality is unique and irreplaceable. Therefore, any influences such as parasitic attacks will be impossible because of the ability to local reorganization. Now, I know this is a very, very difficult concept, but we will have a lot of opportunities to talk about details of this idea later on. Remember, we introduced the idea of dilution. In other words, dilution of overwhelming, unique influences, such as those employed by parasites. So, with higher planes of mental activity, with higher organization, and with local uniqueness, there is less need for these universal and uniform aids, universal and uniform tools, walls, artificial separation for defense, sets, classifications, categories, classes, boundaries, contrasts, distinctions, contours. These are, of course, very useful aids, and they can help in terms of defense. But they are just that. They are tools for mental organization and for defense. They have an alternative, though, where sets, categories, and classifications will not be as useful. And that is a locally unique, cultivated mind, where these things will apply less and less and less. Rigid rules, external laws, absolute reference frames are extremely useful in first approximations, in orientation, or as didactic tools in terms of teaching, if mental infancy is the case. But as we move along and we have more mental organization, these kind of mental aids, crutches, this type of tools will become less and less and less relevant and less necessary. Reality is highly variable with very complex variations, infinite potential combinations, but with fairly frequent similar patterns in a locality. When you have similar patterns in a locality, then these patterns will lead to the idea of regularity, rules, even laws, even natural laws, which all have domains, local domains, depending on circumstances and conditions in which they tend to occur frequently. Now, the idea, though, is that these circumstances and conditions will be in constant flux. They will change. And sometimes the rate of change is so slow that it escapes recognition. And that, of course, depends on the resolution of the observer, of the thinker, of the mind. So what kind of rate of change, at what scale of change we are able to detect? That doesn't exclude that there is a change that we are not able to detect. Quick and sudden changes, which are high contrast, high contour, they are very dense, so they are easy to detect. They are easily recognized. For instance, there is a death of a human individual. The death of a human individual is a very high contrast event because there is a sudden change. So that is something that is very easy to detect. And it's very inducive of thinking that there is a separation in time between what was before and what will be. But refinement of function is able to detect slow change also, more gradual change, so that these rapid and high contrast changes will be then put into perspective. The density of change is called events. The density of matter is called objects. The density of unique locality is called individual. These are high contrast, easy to detect mental products, mental concepts, which depend on how the mind recognizes things. Now, the challenge, our challenge, is to recognize change without seeing reality as spotty. So in other words, we should be able to see more refined, more gradual, more slow changes as well. And then all of a sudden, these high contrast densities will be seen in a different perspective because we see how they are being prepared, how they are part of a process. So, mental uniqueness will provide dilution, dilution of densities. But this dilution of densities will require very high ability to high resolution so that we detect the more gradual, slower changes. And if that is the case, then we don't just focus our attention on very easily detectable high density changes, such as birth of or death of a human individual. So seeing the underlying pattern is dependent on mental refinement and consequently the ability to detect very fine things, which we call resolution, resolution of the mind. As resolution improves, then distinctness and boundaries will tend to blur. No distinct units, no sets with members, no multitude, no uniform measures, no universality, no rules, no laws, no numbers, will be seen as absolute objective entities. We have continuous change, we have infinite variety, we have infinite complexity, which makes these ideas of sets, members, multitude, numbers, uniform laws, permanent laws, as almost superfluous. We don't need these things, these mental tools, these mental constructs. So, to demonstrate all of this, we take an example of the human body at the eyesight scale. In other words, we look at a human body, an individual human body, with the naked eye. And what do we see? We have clear, distinct borders, sharp contours. Like this. On the left-hand side, we have the eyesight scale with the naked eye, and the naked eye sees a clear, distinct contour, sharp contour, and we see a relative permanence of this contour. So this contour then will create the idea, the concept of a unit. If there is a border, if there is a contour, if there's a high contrast change between one part of space and another part of space, then we perceive distinctness, creating a unit. Like, for example, a physical human body, an individual body. But if we change scales, for example, we look at the human body, the individual human body at an atomic scale, then we see that there are no sharp borders at all. We see molecules going back and forth. We have proteins constantly changing shapes under different conditions. We see this. There is no sharp contours. There is constant communication between one organic part of space and another organic part of space. So what we perceive as a distinct human individual, a unit, it has, depending on the scale, different properties in terms of contours. So borders and contours are attention aids. They help us to focus on things. But if we look at different scales, and if we dig deeper or go down to a smaller scale, for example, we will immediately see that these things are anchored in our minds to certain circumstances. For instance, certain scales, like the naked eye, how the individual sees another individual by the naked eye. And because of these borders and contours, we create concepts such as units or categories, and then we class them, and then we make sense of them. And this will certainly help us to make order in our minds, to sort things, sort out things. But these are methods. These are methods employed by the human mind, tools that are necessary. And these tools are necessary at different degrees, depending on how organized the mental activity is and how small resolution the mind has to detect fine changes or fine differences or varieties. Now, the example here is the one of a knight's armor, for example. So it is made out of steel or iron or some kind of hard metal. And at one, depending on the circumstances, for example, temperature, at a certain scale in temperature, it appears as having an intrinsic property of hardness, of durability, of solidity. But the minute that the temperature changes, then this property that we think is intrinsically related to that thing, which we call an armor, changes immediately. And the point is that the temperature may be usual, often the same, but the conditions and circumstances always change to some degree. And then the same thing that at one moment seems solid, hard, and durable, it just the changes of a temperature, not to mention other factors, can become liquid, malleable, and easy to form. So any intrinsic property of anything is linked to a certain scale of different circumstances and conditions. For example, scales of temperature, or sight, or spatial position, or time scales. Now, these things create domains. Domains are local conditions under which certain observational patterns seem relatively unchanged, constant, and permanent. But domains are always local, you see, because conditions change from one time point to another time point and one space point to another space point. They never really stay the same. So patterns may be similar at this locality and another locality, but they are never the same, not in space, not in time. Now you may extend domains assuming that circumstances and conditions will remain constant in time and in space. But that is an artificial fixation, which in reality very rarely takes place. So this is a picture of an armor made out of metal, which is solid, hard, and durable. And just one thing out of an infinite number of parameters that might change may change the property of this armor very dramatically. It becomes something very different, just as the temperature changes. But there are an infinite number of other factors that may change the intrinsic, permanent, universal, absolute property of anything. Poisons need a certain concentration to act. In other words, a poison is a poison only at one specific scale of a dose. In other doses or circumstances, what is poison at one particular set of circumstances will become not harmful and not poisonous at all. So a poison is a poison given certain fixed circumstances or similar circumstances, but not in absolute. The viruses, the same thing. They need a certain load to overwhelm the immune system. A lower load has actually a vaccine effect, promoting the ability of the immune system to fight off a viral infection. So the virus, the same virus, under different circumstances and conditions, will behave dramatically differently. So in other words, how can we define a fixed, standard, universal, absolute set of circumstances and conditions to call a virus? Because it will behave entirely differently at different loads, not to mention other possible influences like the relative strength of the virus and the immune system, for example. the rock, stone, rocks. They are often regarded as the symbol of permanence, but under different circumstances, they might not be very permanent at all. They may be washed away, diluted by water. A pyramid, overgrown by the jungle. If there is no cultivation of the pyramid, then the jungle will naturally overgrow it without sharp contours, without sharp differences between an artificial uh, space and the natural surroundings. It will blur in time. And that's what takes us to the next level. Life is flexible. Life is variable. It is not set. It changes according to circumstances and conditions. It changes continuously. Now, the scale of change may be detectable to some and not detectable to others. The mental resolution may be different, but the change is there nevertheless. Different people are able to detect different densities. So perceived events, objects, individuals seem as a unit because they are dense things that are easy to grasp, to understand, to recognize. And so if there are events, objects, and individual units, then these appear and disappear. But if the mind is more, has more resolution, if the mind is more refined because it is organized, because it is robust, because it is abundant with a lot of organized knowledge, then we do not need these densities. We don't need very high contour events because we recognize also processes, very gradual changes and very gradual differences. And we see that with every object, or rather every pattern, is local and locally different, which leads us to the idea of uniqueness. Now, we come to the idea of mathematics and how this relates to everything that we said uh, in connection with the previous slides. And mathematics is going to be so important in this regard that we are going to cut this slide in two, and the rest of the slide will be then talked about during the next video. So let us summarize all of what we said. We said that the fruit tree is an organism, that the individual fruit is an integral part of this organism, very highly unique, but it's connected. They are in organic relationships, mind and body, left and right are examples, easy to understand examples of this organic relationship. We identified that with mental refinement, not only highly dense things such as events and objects are obvious, but that we are able to see more gradual differences, more gradual change as well. So things look much less like individual units, such as an event. They look much more like slow, gradual changes, processes, mechanisms. And then we see patterns as not fixed patterns due to fixed, standard, absolute, universal laws and rules, standardization, but that they are all similar but unique. And this uniqueness is what defines domains for every rule, for every category, and that these things cannot exist without domains. And domains are always local. Now, I realize that these concepts that I talked about during this third video are extremely complex. I also realize that they are not only complex, but they are they represent a radical new approach, which is very strange, very different from what prevails in 2022. And therefore, I ask that these things be regarded as vague impressions that help intuition. And this is still kind of an introduction so that we will talk about these things in very great detail in future chapters. And the next video is going to talk about mathematics. And then we are going to introduce the idea of standardization, fixations, but we are also going to introduce the idea of extension. And both standardization and extension are going to be based on what we talked about in regards to the three things that we introduced today: the fruit tree, organism, and dilution. And with that, I thank you for your attention and goodbye.